Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Tuesday, it is the 4th day of August, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this, our second day of live broadcasting here at the Virtual Center. I do welcome you to today's program. I, of course, remind you, as I'm sure you know if you are with us at the beginning of our program here, that we start on Tuesdays 1/2 hour later than we do on Mondays and Wednesdays. Whereas our program is a full 2 hours on Mondays and Wednesdays, we only do 90 minutes on Tuesday and Thursday, on Tuesday rather. Primarily because of my schedule. I have a Rotary meeting that adjourns at 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, and I can barely get home and get set up in order to do the program. But other than that, I'm sure that those of you who are tuned in know that, and I just wanted to welcome you. I wanted to thank you for your continued support for the Virtual Center and for your continued support for the Head On Radio Network, and I encourage you to make that a priority. I really believe that the further we go into some of these programs, the more it dawns on me, or it becomes even more clear to me how very important it is to offer an alternative voice, if you will, to the voice that is the voices that are so well funded, that seem to come from a particular ideological perspective. I just believe that it is absolutely vital. I saw a little item on Facebook this morning that I chuckled about, but I think it's very important. Apparently, a member of an environmental group was successful in setting up Scott Walker. Yeah, Scott Walker, in one of his appearances in Manchester, New Hampshire, at a pizza parlor. Supposedly, he had a Scott Walker for President sign, and he approached the candidate and asked him if he would pose for a photograph. Well, and they could hold up the sign. And Scott Walker agreed. So they posed, he and a female accomplice of his, a colleague of his, with Scott Walker in the middle, and they had the sign, and they had the photographer ready to take the picture. And just before they took the picture, he flipped the sign. And on the back of the sign was an image of a check for $900 million for Scott Walker's presidential campaign, signed by the Koch brothers. So that and the intent in the lower left-hand corner of the check, where you have a space where you can put what the check is for, it basically said for climate denial. And so it was one of those gotcha moments, which I kind of enjoyed reading about. But at the same time, I think the $900 million check, so to speak, just reminds us of how much money is going into bankrolling these particular ideological points of view. And when you compare the funding that goes into that side of the line, if you will, with the kind of funding that we're dealing with, which is totally listener-supported here at the Head On Radio Network, I think it is so important that we continue to support it and keep this progressive voice on the air. So thank you for joining us. I welcome you to today's program, and I thank you for your continued support and your willingness to support the programming that we present here on a regular basis. I do want to, as we usually do at the beginning of every program, I want to make you aware that we do have the opportunity. This is not intended by any stretch of the imagination to be a one-way dialogue, a one-way monologue, and hopefully what we're envisioning is conversation and dialogue and back and forth interaction, and we've had a number of callers do that in the past. We want you to know that we have a number a phone number that is available to you if you would like to get on the air and offer your thoughts or your criticisms or suggestions or ideas or concerns or whatever you might have that are related to the topics that we deal with here at the Virtual Center. That phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you are a little bit reluctant to get on the air and you would rather make your comments via email to me directly, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. I'm going to hang up for 1 second here. I apologize. My headphones came apart, and I was kind of hanging on to one half of them here, so I had to kind of reconnect the headphones. My email address again is waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And I do remind you again of our newly created Facebook page for the Virtual Center. If you go to the Virtual Center, you will find the Facebook page, and I try to regularly post copy, and there are places there at the end of each item for you to make a comment if you have something you would like to say. It obviously, as all Facebook entries do, it asks you to like it or like what's there. But there is also an opportunity to comment if you choose to comment. And I encourage you to do that if you are so inclined. In fact, based on our program yesterday, I posted an item on our Facebook page earlier today before we came on the air about yesterday's program, and I thought that it's entirely likely, since this went on Facebook only about 2 or 3 hours ago. It's quite likely that many people tuned in haven't had a chance to see it yet. So I thought that, given the fact that it does relate to our program yesterday, which was principally built on entry into an analysis of James Madison's Federalist Number 10, excuse me, I thought that it might be a good idea to open with that Facebook entry and use that as a mechanism for not only reviewing some of the issues that we touched on yesterday, but again, I had mentioned yesterday that we wouldn't need a lot of introductory time for review today, that we would get right back into Madison's Federalist Number 10 and see if we could make some real progress in that today, with the idea that we can move through it rather rapidly and hopefully complete Federalist Number 10 in tomorrow's program here at the Virtual Center. I was trying to come up with something this morning that would give me an opportunity to put an item on Facebook which would draw attention to the program, draw attention to our topic, to Madison's Federalist Number 10. And it's really interesting. My wife kind of chuckles about this because she says it really speaks to who I am. But I woke up this morning and she said, she made a comment and said, did you sleep well? And I said, I really did, but I apparently in the last couple of hours I've been kind of in and out and dreaming a little bit. And she said, oh really, what about? And I said, Madison's Federalist Number 10. And she said, oh my God, nobody else. And what was bugging me for some reason was one particular sentence in the excerpts in Federalist Number 10 that we looked at yesterday, which is just really getting into the document. We really didn't get that far. And what I mean is, all we were able to deal with yesterday is Madison's explanation or establishment of the problem. And we didn't get into any of his approaches as to how to address the nature of that problem. And that's really what the essence of Federalist Number 10 is about. So we really haven't gotten into the issue yet. The only thing that we've had an opportunity to do thus far is play with Madison's idea or conception of the problem and try to get a handle on that. The more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that really the controversy, if there is one, about Federalist Number 10 focuses on the nature of the problem itself. Let me explain what I mean. Madison's Federalist Number 10 is probably the most famous of all the Federalist Papers. It's the most frequently cited. It's the most frequently referenced. And the reason that it is considered to be the most important of the Federalist Papers is because in it, the author, the initial author of the Constitution, recognizing that during the course of the convention a lot of amendments and changes were made in the initial plan introduced by James Madison, which, as we know, is the so-called Virginia Plan, which was introduced at the very outset of the Constitutional Convention. But for all practical purposes, when Madison is referred to as the father of the Constitution, that's the reason, because he actually drafted or created the first draft of what becomes the Constitution, namely the Virginia Plan. And that's the reason that Federalist Number 10 is so often referenced, so frequently cited, is because the author of the Constitution wrote this particular Federalist paper, and in it he explained the nature of the problem that the Constitution was designed to address. And then he began to provide or offer ways that we might go about addressing these problems. And through the process of elimination, as we'll see in Federalist Number 10, he basically says there are two ways to do this, but you can't use that one and you can't use this one. So that means that we only have this option. And then there are two ways to address this option. We can go this way or we can go that way. And through this process of elimination, Madison basically brings us down to the point where he gives us, toward the end of the document, his explanation of what the most viable approach toward addressing the nature of the problem, which he defines at the outset of the Federalist paper. He lays out what he believes is the optimum solution. The real issue is the definition of the problem. I don't know that there's as much controversy surrounding the solution. There's a lot of disagreement about Madison's analysis and Madison's solution. There's a lot of speculation as to what he might mean and what he probably does mean, as opposed to what he clearly doesn't mean. And a lot of people get into that. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of alternative approaches to what Madison's priorities are and what he's all about and how he approaches them, and whether in fact his commitment to republicanism is as firm as he says it is, and all the rest of it. But while there is disagreement over Madison's meaning, there really isn't a lot of controversy about what he's trying to do. Once we understand the nature of the issues that he wants the Constitution to address, then he begins to approach the various ways to deal with those problems. And again, there's disagreement about his approaches and about the way he deals with it, but there's a difference between disagreement and controversy. I would suggest the real controversy for Federalist Number 10 is Madison's conceptualization of the problems. Because there's an inclination or a tendency, a reluctance on the part of a lot of people who deal with American history and American government to deal with the problems as Madison defines them. A lot of people are very, very uncomfortable with the problems that Madison is laying out in Federalist Number 10. Mainly because they are very controversial problems. They deal with the issue of class and issues associated with inequality. And the issues basically come down to who really has the most influence over in our political system as it is constructed. In other words, the controversy is whether, in fact, this explanation of Madison's is really the definition of the major problems that we want our young people to be exposed to. The way we have, in our society, in our education system, the way we have traditionally chosen to deal with these kinds of problems is to pretend they're not there, and to avoid introducing the nature of these problems to our students. We spend an awful lot of time trying to convince our young people that in America, what makes America the nation that it is that we don't have issues of inequality and issues of class and issues of favoritism. We don't have situations where certain people's influence and voice is greater than other people. We tend to shy away from allegations that those people with influence and money in our society tend to be the most often listened to and tend to affect government policy and government programs more than the average citizen. We tend to avoid or to deny the realities of those who allege that our vote is meaningless, that compared to the power that big money brings to the table, my meaningless vote is insignificant. We don't like that. We realize that if that idea becomes too prevalent, our political system, our republic as we know it, will be in trouble. But at the same time, we're very uncomfortable with that kind of definition of the problem. So the way we most often deal with it, especially with young people, is to deny it, is to just flat out deny it and tell young people that it's not true. So I would suggest to you that the first paragraph, the first page of Federalist Number 10, as it were, Madison's conceptualization of the problem that the problems that the Constitution is intended to address, is really the most controversial aspect of the whole document. And let me go back for evidence of that to the publication of Charles Beard's Economic Interpretation of the Constitution in 1913. When Beard's book came out in 1913, in which he addressed specifically the financial and political intent of the founders and suggested that the easiest and the best and most meaningful way to understand the Constitution of the United States is to look at the economic intent behind it. Look at the economic priorities of the people who drafted it. Look at the economic priorities of the people who were most advocated and voted for it. And Beard's argument is you will get a much more accurate reflection as to why the Constitution says what it says once you begin to look at the economic priorities of those who drafted it, those who created it.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
Remember exactly where you are, because I can't wait for you to go into this in further depth. But before you do, John, out west, on the road, has a question for you. Okay?
Oh, great, Bob. Thank you. Hi, John.
Hello.
How you doing, buddy?
Short, fat, cute, you know this stuff.
Yeah.
I got a question for you, and I'm hoping this dovetails what you're talking about, and I'm not interrupting you too much.
No, you're not. Don't worry about it. Go ahead.
But because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, maybe I might be, but because that at the time of the Constitution, the people who were allowed to vote were only white landed people, if I'm not mistaken, did that not, I'll use the term corrupt as just a generic definition, but didn't that kind of corrupt the system to say it was going to be, because like you talked about earlier about they were worried about the individual states passing things like deferral of bankruptcies and forgiveness of debts and stuff like that. Is it safe to say that the Constitution was to a large extent created as a mechanism to protect the land? Well, I'm using the term landed gentry as a kind of a generic term.
John, I know what you mean, though. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. Would it not be safe to say that that was part of what was being put together as a way, and partially also, they keep saying that the United States is not a suicide pact, but at the same time, when there are legal scholars that say that in actuality, if you look at it from a strictly legal sense, South Carolina, Georgia, et cetera, they actually did have the right to withdraw from the Union legally.
Right.
And if you don't mind, if you could expand on that a little bit.
Okay. On the Confederation, which is the system of government that existed when the Constitution was created, the Articles of Confederation was not a union in the traditional sense that the Constitution is. And what I mean by that is it was a union, but it was union of independent sovereign states who chose to unite for their own mutual benefit. But in no way did the central organization have control over the members. The power was retained by each individual state. And so what that means is that you're right. If a state chose to withdraw from the Confederation, it could do that. Because the very opening, the very beginning of the Articles of Confederation, Article 1, makes very clear that the Confederation is a league of friendship among free, sovereign, independent states. So effectively, what that means is that in political terms, the Articles of Confederation was comprised of 13 independent nations. I would suggest to you that the similarity, the best example of that today is the European Union, which is made up of independent nations in Europe. But these nations do not give up their sovereignty or their freedom or their cultures or their languages or their traditions. And that was really what the debate with the euro is about, because many people who want a stronger union for the European Union believe that the common currency, the euro, is a way to bring these nations closer and closer together to the point that they will eventually agree to give the central organization some power over the members. And, that's really the difference between the Confederation and the Union that is created by the Constitution of the United States. And the southern states, at the time of the Civil War, for example, South Carolina argued that while the Constitution made changes in the nature of the federal government, it did not totally deny the reality of state freedom and state independence. And so therefore, South Carolina's position is that the Union was created by free and independent states, and these states retain the right to secede from it if they so choose. And Lincoln's going to war in the Civil War for purposes of preserving the Union is his effort to demonstrate that states lost their sovereignty, their freedom and independence to secede when they ratified the Constitution. Because the Constitution was not ratified by each state. The Constitution was ratified by the people of each state, which meant that when ratification finally became official, it was ratified by the people of the United States, not the people of each independent state independently, if that makes sense. And so what that means is that once the Union is created, once the Constitution is ratified, that means that the citizens of each state become a minority in the context of the whole Union. So therefore, Lincoln is able to argue that when a state like South Carolina tries to secede, it is in a state of rebellion, because it is a minority rebelling against the majority, and that cannot be. So that's really the constitutional issue surrounding the difference between the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. That's I think the first point, John, but it's an important one. The other thing that I wanted to say in response to what you said is you are not taking us off track at all. This is absolutely takes us right where we're going. And that's the issue of whether, in fact, the Constitution of the United States was intended principally to protect the few, the upper classes, the landed gentry, as you call them, the wealthy, the property, and the influential. And that's principally what Beard argued. And that's principally why there was so much animosity and so much hostility toward Beard's economic interpretation, because many people found it quite offensive to even imply that the drafters, the creators of the Constitution of the United States, were creating a union that primarily was designed to benefit them and people that like them, rather than all the people, as of course that's what the Constitution presumes to say, is that it basically establishes a republic and equality before the law among all citizens, no matter their wealth, no matter their class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what Beard is doing is challenging the basic mission and ethic, if you will, of the Union, of the Republic, because he's arguing that the people who drafted it the way they did in order to benefit themselves first. And there's no way in the world that loyal, patriotic Americans were going to stand back and take that. So immediately, a number of studies came out, a number of responses came out by scholars challenging Beard. And one of the ones, and this specifically refers to what you mentioned, John. One of them is a study which Robert Brown does it. He focuses principally in Massachusetts when he makes this. But one of the major criticisms of Beard is that Beard makes a big thing out of property qualifications for voting and office holding in order to allege that the Constitution was drafted by and ratified by a relatively small proportion of the citizenry, that the people in mass didn't come out and support the Constitution. Property qualifications made it impossible for all but the minority to have a political say. The challenge to that is a number of scholars and researchers went into individual states and began to find that even though there were property qualifications for voting and office holding, more people could meet them than we ever imagined, than Beard ever imagined. And that, acquiring property valued at 50 pounds, given the fact that government was giving land away in order to encourage settlers to come here, acquiring land valued at 50 pounds or whatever the particular amount was, depending on the state, was relatively easy. And that the only thing that property qualifications did was prevent those with no property from voting. But the fact of the matter is, most reputable people owned enough property to qualify to vote. They didn't necessarily vote, though. The fact of the matter is, the turnouts were very, very small proportionally. But the argument was that wasn't because of the property qualifications. They tried to say that was because most people supported what was going on and they just didn't bother to go out and register their approval. In other words, that many people were indifferent or, were indifferent to political reality and just didn't vote. But what they were basically saying is that they were becoming part of what Nixon called the silent majority. That the fact that they didn't vote against it doesn't mean that they didn't support it. They just didn't come out and express their support. So basically, what critics of Beard argued was that Beard was a little bit off base there because property qualifications didn't deny the vote to nearly as many people as Beard assumed that property qualifications did deny the vote to. And the controversies have raged since then, but as far as the basic premise or the basic positions that Beard adopts, nobody has been able to totally refute Beard, because there's absolutely no question that if you read Federalist Number 10, there's absolutely no question that those people with substantive, meaningful property, with position in their colonies, with positions of power and influence, with higher education, college degrees, and all the rest of it, clearly they were very disturbed by what was happening in the states under the Confederation when taxpayers were organizing in anti-tax movements and all of that to postpone taxes, suspend the payment of taxes, suspend the payment of private debts, and all the rest of it. In other words, what was happening is the people on the bottom end, if you will, the poor, were massing and expressing their will to the point that government really had no option but to go along with them. So in a sense, we were coming very close to the idea of direct democracy. People were demanding things from government and they were getting it. And Madison's position was that you can't have a society this way. And the only way to do it is to make this kind of direct democracy by the majority impossible. And that's what the Constitution did.
Yeah,
it's very complicated, but it's a hell of a story.
Yeah, well, didn't one of the founding fathers make some statement to the tune of that the republic would last as long as the people did not vote themselves, learn that they could vote themselves largesse or something like that?
Well, yeah, Franklin is reputed to have. Somebody asked him when the convention adjourned, what they had done, what we had, and his supposed response is a republic if we can keep it. And the implication is that the nature of the government that the Constitution was created required the kind of mass participation and support that would make Republican government operative, that would make it meaningful and workable. And the idea is that if we didn't follow through, if we didn't participate, if we just deferred to our betters and let them run things, then in effect we could lose the whole thing. Well, and that's essentially where we are right now. I think we're in danger of doing that.
Yeah, well, you had the big confab here recently with the Koch brothers doing their dog and pony show and all the. You had to admit for Trump made one good solid statement. He was talking about the dancing that everybody was doing to cater to the Kochs over this last weekend. So that was kind of funny. But anyway,
he basically alleged that many of these people that were kowtowing to the Koch brothers were puppets. Yeah. And the reality is that that's the whole point. They are. Because they become so dependent on money that the people with the money are able to call the shots, and they're able to demand the candidates to be for certain things and against certain things. They're controlling agendas. They're controlling policy by the threat of withholding money. And what they're saying to these guys is, if you want to get reelected, you better vote the way we tell you. Otherwise, we'll pull our financial support from you and we'll give it to somebody else. For the Supreme Court to deny that that even is happening is bizarre. I mean, the Supreme Court, talk about head in the sand. I mean, the Supreme Court is saying there's no meaningful, appreciable, substantive evidence that big money is buying votes. I mean, that is absolutely bizarre. But
yeah, well, that's the ultimate faction there. I guess Madison would be turning over in his grave because.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah.
And I personally believe that there's a lot more to Madison than this. John, I really appreciate your call so much. You weren't taking us on a different track. You were absolutely taking us down the one that I was going on anyway. So thank you.
No trouble at all. Bye-bye.
Appreciate you, John. Bye. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that call. Talk about being on target. I mean, John hit the nail right in the head. When Charles Beard wrote the economic interpretation of the Constitution, he created a firestorm because he was imputing the integrity and the intent of the founders. And that was considered to be un-American. And the entire profession jumped on the attack on Beard. And what we had here was the Beard is probably one of the biggest guns, at least, if not the first, of what we call the progressive school of American history. And these progressives, some of them, began to take Beard's economic interpretation seriously and began to focus their research on digging out the dirt on particular members of the convention, on particular founders. And so the consequence of this was we ended up finding out a lot more about the nature of the delegates, of who they were, what they were after, what they were worth, what their priorities were, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, it created problems for those who want to turn history into hero worship. And the only way that you can continue to do that is to attack Beard. And a lot of people have. Robert Brown's book, which is a direct effort to refute Charles Beard's economic interpretation, is called Middle Class Democracy in Massachusetts. And basically what Brown talks about is the nature of agrarian America. The availability of land made it possible for people to emigrate from other places in the world and come into this country and become middle class, become landowners. And in many of the nations that these people came from, that kind of social mobility was impossible anywhere but here. But because of the availability of land, it was possible for landless people to come here and to become middle-class, reputable landowners, which throughout the developed world, the ownership of land was the symbol or the signal of position and influence and power. And to be able to come from a culture in which you had no opportunity to move up and become a landowner ever, to the opportunity to come across the ocean and automatically become a landowner and own your own land, or even for the very poor to come here as indentured servants and work for a period of years to pay off your indenture and then be granted land. Your period of indenture was like going to college. You forego earning a living for 4 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it might be, with the idea that there's a payoff at the end. And so you invest in a college education, in a degree, or in a graduate degree, with the idea that your investment will pay off in the future. Poor people came to this country as indentured servants based on the idea that they could work for a period of years and then become landowners, which was opportunity that was available in no place else, at least in Europe. Because Europe was principally a rigid class system where you were what you were born into and you never changed. You became what your father became, or your father was. And if you were born into a landless situation, you remained that way. And so America became the land of opportunity for so many people. And that was the basis of middle-class stature in America. So Robert Brown's book is called Middle-Class Democracy in Massachusetts. And that's his whole point, is that more people could meet property qualifications for voting and office holding than Beard or those who supported him ever even imagined. And then Brown points to the fact that doesn't mean that people turned out in droves to vote, because they didn't. But Brown's position is, in order to find out why they didn't vote, you have to go into the history deeper. But it's clear to him that the property qualifications were not the reason they didn't vote, if they owned land. But what property qualifications did do was keep the desperate, people who own nothing, out of the political process. Because these people were dangerous. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by change. And so therefore, people with property and people with position, people with substance, were not willing to risk it by giving the vote to people who were desperate and had nothing to lose by change. If you own something, you become very suspicious of change, because you become very protective of what you own, even if it's not much. There's an absolutely wonderful scene early in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, of the dust, focused on the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, where before these people migrated to California in search of jobs, they had to give up the land they owned in Oklahoma because it was so dry that it wouldn't produce anything. And in the film, The Grapes of Wrath, there's a fantastic story about a bulldozer that's brought in to knock down the home of this particular Oklahoma farmer. And in tears, he drops to his knees, and he takes his fingers and he digs his fingers into this dry soil, which is merely sand. And he lifts up two fistfuls of sand and lets the sand fall through his fingers. And he makes this statement. Faulkner is just beautiful with words. He makes this statement and says, "It ain't much, but it's mine." And that's the whole point. When you own anything, you become vested in the future. You become conservative. If you think about it, you become much more conservative, much more careful, much more cautious. You want to grow what you've got, but you also want to protect what you've got so you don't lose it. You're not willing to bet everything on change. The people who will do that are the people who own nothing and have nothing to lose. Those you want to keep out of the ballot. Those you want to keep out of the polls from voting. And that's really what the property requirements legislation in most states did. But as we know, beginning in the early 19th century, associated with the Jackson administration, state after state began to reduce until finally they eliminated property qualifications. And again, James Madison, in the document we looked at that Madison wrote, in which he's advocating open voter enrollment in Virginia, Madison's in 1829 made this absolutely brilliant pitch for the idea of dropping property qualifications entirely. Because his argument was, it's becoming clear that fewer and fewer people in this country are going to be able to own property. And as long as we continue to associate people being vested in the system with property, we're dealing with a future in which too many people will be forced or kept outside that system. And so Madison's position is, we've got to find an alternative to property to vest them. We've got to find an alternative way to give everybody a vested interest, a stake in this society and its future. And Madison's position was, if we play it right, the right to vote can become as much of a stake as property was initially. And so Madison's position was, in 1829, if you don't have the property necessary to give everybody the opportunity to become a landowner, you can give everybody the vote, and then emphasize that to them as giving them a vested interest, as giving them a say in the policies and the procedures under which they will be governed. The concept is an absolutely brilliant one, it seems to me. That's really what the whole idea of property qualifications are all about. But again, I think there's real substance to the position, there's real credibility in the position that Beard didn't engage in the kind of research into property qualifications to the degree that would have led him to realize that property qualifications didn't keep as many people from voting as he alleged they did in his economic interpretation. Okay, if you read the economic interpretation that Beard writes, the implication is the wealthiest and the most positioned and the most influential came together, they do all the voting, they hold all the offices, they make all the decisions. Well, the fact of the matter is, if that's true, and indeed it could be, it's becoming clear today that big money is carrying so much influence in our political system, then the reality is, if that's true, then there must be other reasons why people aren't voting other than property qualifications, because most people could meet those. And so I think that, as much as anything else, my position is what Beard and his progressive followers did, as far as I'm concerned, is they drove people into the sources. They drove people to do the kind of in-depth research that really helped us understand and get more insight into what made this society tick in the 17th and 18th centuries. I think we've learned more as a result. I think basically the reason we saw this is because many people felt challenged by Beard. And so in a sense that's good, I think. But anyway, that's really the story. So it seems to me that is the issue that we need to think about as we look at Madison's Federalist number 10. Because you can read Madison's Federalist number 10 and you can find in it what you want. The fact of the matter is, what you've got to do is suspend what you want and get into the document in order to understand what he says and deal with that. It may turn out that what he says coincides with what you want. But it may also turn out that it doesn't. And it seems to me, if your research is going to be honest, you've got to be willing to face that reality. But the reality is many people are not. And the way we have approached in our education system, the way we have approached these kinds of issues, if they are going to be uncomfortable to present to young people, then we choose to dodge them or to deny them. And the reality is, when we look at what's happening in our schools, many of the kids are able to see through this. Kids today are not willing to accept the old idea, it's true because I say it is, and I'm the teacher. So in reality, it seems to me, I believe that youngsters will be willing to engage truth if we give them the opportunity to deal with it. That's why I'm such an advocate of primary documents, primary sources. That's really kind of what we're doing here at the Virtual Center. Let me, and again, our introductory portion of our program has obviously extended itself into a point where we've already reached 20 minutes after the hour. We've been on 50 minutes already, and we haven't really gotten back into the document itself yet, but that's okay. The document will be there. It's been there since late 1787. So an extra day or an extra 2 days or whatever is worth it, especially if what we're doing contributes to our ability to understand it, and I believe to appreciate it, because I think the document is that rich. On Facebook today, my effort to try to encourage people to tune into the program or to become joiners, become participants in our efforts here at the Virtual Center, was to just share a thought about what we did yesterday. And what I focused on was one particular sentence from the early portion of Madison's Federalist Number 10. And here it is. You'll remember this if you were with us yesterday. Madison says, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided, not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority." That's a quote from an early paragraph in Federalist Number 10. This is the way I presented on Facebook the kind of analysis that I think becomes possible when you deal with primary source materials. In essence, the reason I want to put this on Facebook is because I wanted to demonstrate what's possible, the learning experience that is possible when you engage in conversation and dialogue, and when you read critically. So basically, what I wanted people to understand is, if you look at this sentence of Madison's quickly, if you give it a quick read, if you skim it, you're going to read it one way. But if you begin to read it carefully and begin to ask questions about it, you're going to discover meaning there that you didn't even know was there. That's what we're after. That's cognitive education. That's the cognitive, educational, or academic experience. That's what makes learning exciting. That's the kind of learning that the founders claimed would set you free. The link between education and freedom is not the ability to hear and memorize truth as somebody else defines it. True education that will set one free is the kind of education that comes from your willingness to engage the facts and to pull out the learning that is there, the knowledge that is there, when you massage and really engage the information. This is the way I explained it on Facebook. This is one of James Madison's most poignant sentences in Federalist Number 10. On first reading, it seems to indicate to those reading it, the existence of serious danger to the nation. The elements of this danger include a real threat to the nation's system of justice and violations of the people's liberty, minority rights, and the very stability of society itself, all brought on by the injustices and hostilities of an out-of-control, what Madison calls overbearing majority, in the constant rivalries between hostile parties. Most people would read this and buy in immediately to Madison's call for a remedy. This poses real problems. The system is unstable. Complaints are being heard from the most considerate and virtuous citizens. Decisions are being made that aren't consistent with justice or the rights of the minor party, the rights of minorities, but basically we're dealing with the overbearing power of majorities who are dictating truth to everybody else. On initial reading, a superficial read or a skim of this would indicate, my God, yeah, Madison's right. He's really identified a problem. Hell, whatever he says, we better take this on. We better fix this. But then I caution. And I said, but wait. There seems to be more to this than meets the eye on first reading. For example, who are the most considerate and virtuous citizens? Clearly, they're not the types most likely to be involved in the rivalries and the conflicts of the rival parties that Madison talks about. These would tend to be your lesser types, the people who have time on their hands and leisure to take part in such non-productive activities. Most of these people probably don't work. They don't have jobs. Taking this step one step further, then that would mean that the people doing the complaining would be the best people. The most considerate and virtuous citizens are the best people. They're friendly to public and private faith, whatever that means. If by faith they mean that these are religious people, then that's something all of us can agree on. Likewise, we're all in favor of public and personal liberty like they are. Turns out, though, that in the 18th century, faith, used this way, meant personal responsibility. It meant meeting your private obligations, paying your debts, and your public obligations, paying your taxes. In this context, then, the best people, those doing the complaining, would not be the ones not meeting these obligations. They would be the ones to whom the debts are owed, the creditors. And they would be getting paid not just for private debts, but for public ones as well. Bond and security payments from government paid out of the taxes being collected. But if some people are refusing to pay these taxes, then that's money out of the pockets of the most considerate and virtuous citizens. No wonder they're complaining. In other words, if you take the words that Madison uses in this one sentence and you begin to ask intrusive questions about what he might mean, and then you apply it back into the document, you begin to realize that there's a whole different set of meanings here that you don't see when you skim it. The question, of course, is how many of us are taught to read in this kind of depth. To go on. So the real issue here, the basis of these complaints, is that the best people, the people Madison says are the minority whose rights are being violated, are upset because too many people are not meeting their financial obligations. These then are the private rights under attack. If private rights are being violated, then the private rights Madison is talking about are the rights of creditors to expect payment. Taking it a step further, why aren't these people paying? How are they getting away with that? Because, Madison says, the overbearing majority seems to be outvoting the most considerate and virtuous citizens when it comes to the laws that government is passing. Then it's government itself that is the basis of the complaints. It's allowing the power of majorities to rule the day instead of the best people who Madison believes should be calling the shots, should be ruling the day. That's why, Madison says, our governments are too unstable. The wrong people are making the decisions. But wait, isn't this what democracy is all about? The majority is controlling what government does. Government is finally adhering to the will of the majority of the people. Madison clearly indicates that this is not the public good at all. On the contrary, that's being disregarded in these rivalries between majority and minority. So the public good and justice, at least to Madison, are the same thing. That's what government's principal responsibilities are, to make sure that right and wrong are enforced, whether it's what the majority wants or not. It appears then that we have to conclude, at least from this one short passage from Federalist Number 10, that Madison's principal argument in favor of the new Constitution is that it will end these injustices and instabilities. It will ensure that order and justice returns to the political arena. But in the process, what happens to democracy? Does this mean that the Constitution is not intended to promote democracy, but instead to prevent it? And that government's principal job is to serve the few rather than the many? These are the kinds of conversations that we try to initiate here at the Virtual Center. And then I've closed by saying, will you join us Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at 1, headonradionetwork.com. It seems to me it is so ironic that when John called and apologized for possibly taking us off track, he was actually anticipating that document. Because that document and the sentence that it features from Federalist number 10 was intended to take us to the very same places that John took us in his call, about whether in fact the Constitution was primarily ratified, supported by, and drafted by, and for the interests of the few because of the property qualifications. That's what Beard said. John's right on. And that's the debate. I could spend forever, and not realistically, but metaphorically. We could spend days arguing that that's not true. On the other hand, we could spend days arguing that it is true. It seems to me, then, that the answer to this is not going to be found in our arguing. Because the people who argue the most persuasively are the people who can scream the loudest, or the people who can get their argument on the air most often are going to win. I think that's where we are in our political system today. It seems to me that the answer to that question, the answer as to what Madison, Hamilton, and the others are really all about, has to be found within the record itself, within what they say and what they write. I believe that Madison's Federalist number 10 is one of the most, if not the most, significant documents in early American history, because I believe it makes it possible for us to do that. I believe we can deduce Madison's intent, his assumptions, his goals, his hopes, his fears, by looking and massaging and really engaging Federalist number 10. I think that there is an opportunity for us to get into James Madison's head, to literally pry into his brain and pursue truth. I don't believe there's anything more exciting that any of us could do than to pursue truth. So I don't think the solution to our challenge here, is this a system for the few or is this a system for the many? I don't believe the answer to that is going to be found in our debates. There's a myth that it is. But let me point out, before we get into this, let me point out the dangers of such a myth. There is this belief that if you present all the best arguments on one side and all the best arguments on the other side, that somehow the truth will emerge. But the truth won't emerge unless the people on the receiving ends of these arguments do something with the arguments that are being presented to them. The arguments themselves don't lead us to truth. It's the engagement of the people on the other end of the arguments, their willingness to examine, to critically assess the pros and cons of the different arguments. They're the ones who are on the road to truth. If they don't do that, if they can't do that, then I would suggest then that truth remains the property of those with the most money or the loudest voice. We have got to begin to educate our citizens to be able to engage in this kind of analytical experience. This is education. This is the promise of education. To many of those in power, this is the danger of education. And our education system heretofore has chosen to dodge it, has chosen to avoid it. There's no better example to prove how true this is than to go back, not that far, a couple of weeks, to the attack on truth, to the documents we looked at from Brown and Williamson on the dangers of tobacco, or to the documents we looked at in the deception dossiers on the burning of fossil fuels. The effort of those who seek to challenge science are not to overwhelm science with different science. They are instead to create doubt, to create a sense in the learner, in the recipient of the respective arguments, that there's so many good arguments on both sides here that there's no right answer at all, there's no truth. Therefore, the only thing I can do is go along with the side that makes the best argument. Once you do that, once you surrender to that, once you reach the conclusion that there's no way to know, that there may not even be a truth, but if there is, there's no way for you to know what it is. Once you do that, then the people who should not have the support get it. They win. And that's what these corporations set out to do. They didn't set out to refute science. They set out to create enough controversy and enough doubt so that the general public was left by throwing their hands up in the air and saying there's no way to know what the answer is. Talk about being timely. This is exactly what President Obama said yesterday about his latest plans for controlling the emission of pollution into the environment. The President made the point yesterday that we are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, and we are the last generation to be able to do anything about it. That's brilliant, because that in reality is the ball game. He's right. What he is trying to do is reach people intellectually so that people will understand and see that what the science is telling us, to the best of our knowledge, is what's happening out there in the environment. Those who will challenge that are setting out to challenge the integrity of the argument, challenge the integrity of those making the argument, challenge the integrity and the credibility of the president. They are not able to refute the science. All they can do is attack the credibility of the people delivering the message. That's basically, I think, what we're about here at the Virtual Center. That's what this examination about Federalist Number 10, it seems to me, is all about. I think it will present us rewards. It'll have payoffs that we'll find to be unbelievable. With that, then, let's get back into the document. We've got 15 minutes left in our program today. But that's okay. I'm not too sure that we would take the last hour and 15 minutes and write it off as not meaningful, because I think indeed it was. And I think a significant portion of that meaning and that substance was in John's call. And I appreciate him making it. I thank him for it. You'll recall that after we got through the initial explanation of the problem, Madison made the point, and at the end, and said basically, as much as we would like to believe that what we're saying is not as much of a problem as we're making it out to be, the fact of the matter is we all know that the problem is real. We all know, Madison says, that the effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. We recognize that it's there, and we recognized how serious it is. And then, you'll recall, we closed yesterday's program with Madison's definition of faction. Up until this point in the document, Madison has not defined it. He has described it, but he hasn't defined it. And he has described it in a way which is all negative. He has blamed most of the problems that exist in popular government throughout history on this idea of popular government's tendency toward factions. Now, Madison chooses to define the word. By a faction, Madison says, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. A faction can either be a minority or a majority, Madison says. What defines it is not its size. What defines it is that it is an interest group. It is a group of people who have organized to satisfy their own self-interest. And Madison is assuming that their pursuit of their own self-interest is antagonistic to the public interest. In other words, there's no way, Madison is implying, that individuals pursuing their self-interest can be seen as the public interest. If these people are pursuing their own self-interest, it's because what they're after is not going to benefit us, just them. That's the definition of interest group. They are united by some common impulse of passion or interest that's adverse to the rights of other citizens, adverse to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community at large. These are people with their own agendas. Now, what I want to do is I want to stop here and refer this definition back to the statement that we just looked at about complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens. Because given the analysis that we did about private faith and about public and private liberty, we realized that in the 18th century, private faith related to private responsibilities. Public faith related to public responsibilities. Your responsibility to contribute to the community at large through your taxes, obeying the law, doing what you're supposed to do, doing everything you can do to be a good citizen. All of those things which contribute, none of the things which take away from the public interest. Now Madison's talking about factions. So far they're bad. He's saying they can be a minority or a majority of the whole. In other words, the size of the faction is not the way that one needs to define them. What I would point out at this point is that within the framework of the context which we already looked at, which focuses on the issue of debt and the abilities of the people, the majorities, to organize and exercise their will on government, then it's clear that the faction that most bothers Madison is not the minority faction, it's the majority faction. Madison, at this point, implies that factions by definition are bad. But the implication is the reason that we are here drafting a new constitution is to solve problems not created by the minority faction, but problems created by the majority faction. It's the overbearing majority getting control of government and getting laws passed that satisfy its self-interest that is putting the public interest of the common good in jeopardy. Now Madison goes into his very traditional and I think helpful approach toward problem solving. Madison says there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of factions. So again, he's implying that by definition, factions create mischief. They are bad. And he said there are two ways of controlling, of curing the mischiefs of factions. The one, by removing its causes. The other, by controlling its effects. Translation? Madison says there are two ways we can go at the issue of faction. We can either set out to eliminate its causes. In other words, to do whatever we need to do to make sure that there aren't any factions. Or, as an alternative, we can set out and look for ways to control the effects of factions. So that even if they're there, they can't do any harm. They can't do anything. So now Madison is saying, let's look at each of these and see where it takes us. In the very next line, he says, there are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. So again, you go back. He said we can either eliminate the causes or we can control the effects. Now he's addressing the issue of causes. And he says there are again two ways, two methods of removing the causes of factions. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. So again, there are two ways to address the mischiefs of factions. You can eliminate the causes, control the effects. Let's look at the causes first. There are two ways to eliminate the causes of factions. Either you can take away the liberty, the freedom that is necessary for factions to exist. In other words, just make it illegal for people to belong to factions. Just take away people's freedom to join them, to engage in them. Or the other alternative to getting rid of the causes of factions is to give every citizen the same opinions and the same passions and the same interests. In other words, make everybody the same. Obviously, if everybody's the same, if everybody has the same amount, if everybody has the same interests and the same priorities, then there's no reason for factions because everybody's already the same. Now Madison's going to address each of those two ways of addressing the mischiefs of factions. The first one, which is taking away people's freedom to belong to them, Madison eliminates quickly in one quick paragraph. And so I think we have time to do that today. We're at 5 minutes before the hour. I think we can get through this paragraph in 2 or 3 minutes, and that's a good place to stop. Madison said, it could never be more truly said of the first remedy, taking away liberty, that it's worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. So Madison immediately eliminates the idea of taking away people's freedom to belong to factions. He said the cure would be worse than the disease. That would be like trying to eliminate air because fire needs air. The results would be worse than the problem. So what Madison is saying is, we cannot tamper with people's freedom. That would create more problems than it would solve. And this is why conservatives love James Madison and love the seemingly Lockean origins of Madison. Because Madison is putting a premium on individual freedom. Not on public responsibility, but on individual freedom. So this is a favorite place for conservatives to gather, is around Madison's defense of liberty. But what he has done is basically say that whatever we set out to do to solve the problems that we've just described, problems which are caused principally by popular government's tendencies toward factions. The one thing we can't do is take away people's freedoms. Whatever solution we find, it has got to be a solution based on freedom, not on the denial of freedom. Those of us who grew up and who were living during the Cold War, especially if we go all the way back to the 50s, for example, will remember that the major challenge to Soviet communism, to international communism, was its insistence through Marx on equality. The Soviet system seemed to be driven by Marx's idea that you have to eliminate the classes from society. The government needs to allocate goods and services in such a way that everybody has the same thing. Then you don't have any problems. You don't have any factionalism. And the argument that we made against that Soviet position was, of course, that those people were not free. They were putting the priority on equality, not on freedom. Because the reality was that if you support freedom, then you have to live with the inequality that freedom produces, because everybody has different abilities, different skills, different talents, different breaks, different genes, different upbringing, different education, etc., etc., etc. So if you leave people free, they're going to end up unequal, not equal. If you insist on their being equal, then the only way to do it is to take away their freedom. And that's what we allege that Soviet communism was about. It was anti-freedom. We were pro-freedom. And you can go all the way back to Madison's Federalist number 10 to find the origins of that. I think this is a good place to stop. But again, we're stopping with the promise to continue here at the Virtual Center tomorrow, Wednesday. Our regular time, 1 p.m. I invite you to join us here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for joining us today. Urge you to be safe. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you.